This video was brought to you by Brilliant, and the first 200 people to use the link below will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Over the last few months, a lot of attention has been directed at Russia's economy. The media have spent countless hours tracking the ruble and discussing if and how the new sanctions will affect Putin's war chest. But this emphasis on Russia can obscure the fact that the economy most affected by this war will be Ukraine's, and if estimates are anything to go by, it will be pretty seriously affected. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the impact of the war on Ukraine's economy, how much worse it might get, and how it might recover in the future. Let's start by taking a look at Ukraine's economy pre-war. As of 2020, Ukraine had a GDP of about $150 billion, which, given its population of about 44 million people, came to a GDP per capita of $3,700, according to World Bank data. The median household income in Ukraine was about $2,100, and unemployment was at about 10%. For context, all of these numbers mean that Ukraine was basically one of, if not the poorest country in Europe, with one of the highest unemployment rates to match. In fact, the only metric that Ukraine does well on is debt to GDP, which stands at an impressive 48.9%, one of the lowest in Europe. Regardless though, Ukraine's relative poverty is largely a consequence of the fact that since 2014, Ukraine's economy has been pretty up and down. Ukraine suffered a serious recession after the revolution in 2014, and the economy never quite recovered to its 2013 high, when GDP came in at about $180 billion and GDP per capita was a bit over $4,000. Add to that, pre-war, Ukraine ran a trade deficit averaging about $8 billion a year, which meant that Ukraine imported more than it exported. When it comes to imports, Ukraine's main ones are energy, including coal, oil, and natural gas, and industrial machinery, while its main exports are things like foods and metals. All in all, Ukraine's pre-war economy wasn't in great shape. Despite solid public finances, the country was relatively poor and struggling to reach its pre-revolution highs. And unfortunately for ordinary Ukrainians, Putin's invasion has only made things worse. Before we get into the headline figures, let's just talk a bit about how wars actually impact national economies. Obviously, it goes without saying that wars interrupt the day-to-day functioning of an economy. It's hard to run a business when missiles are falling overhead. But they also affect a country's ability to borrow money on the international markets. Because, well, investors have to price in the possibility that at the end of the war, the country they've lent money to won't exist anymore. And beyond that, wars just take a big toll on the public purse. A modern state has to pay its army, as well as providing relief funding to citizens displaced or affected by the war, all of which they have to do with lower tax revenues. Anyway, what are the material impacts of the war on Ukraine's economy so far? Well, according to analysis by the Kyiv School of Economics from early April, has so far incurred some $100 billion worth of damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. About $40 billion of this comes from damage to roads and other transport infrastructure, which has also obviously had knock-on impacts for the broader economy, because it's made both inter- and intranational trade more difficult. Simultaneously, two of Ukraine's largest metallurgical enterprises have been destroyed, which is pretty terrible news given that iron and steel were Ukraine's largest exports pre-war. The war has also made the Black Sea inaccessible, which is where Ukraine exports and imports most of its stuff from. In fact, most of Ukraine's southern coastline is currently occupied by Russian forces, and the bits that aren't, like Odessa, have been mined by Ukrainian forces to deter Russian ships. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, trade has pretty much collapsed, with exports halving between February and March, and imports falling by more than 2/3. And this is particularly bad news for Ukrainian farmers, who export most of their crop via the Black Sea. While the new planting season is going surprisingly well, apparently about 80% of the usual crop has still been planted, it's unclear what will actually happen when we get to next year's harvest, given that the ports are still blocked and most grain silos are already full. As well as exporters, the war has also disrupted domestic Ukrainian businesses. According to the Ukrainian government, about 30% of Ukrainian businesses have ceased all activities, and 45% are working at reduced capacity. So it perhaps makes sense that some 4.8 million jobs have been lost since the war began, amounting to roughly 30% of all pre-war employment. And the International Labour Organization estimates that this figure could rise to 7 million if the war continues. Add to that, some 5 million Ukrainians have fled the country, while an estimated 7.7 million have been internally displaced. Together, these three factors, the collapse of trade, the pausing of local business activity, and the refugee crisis, mean that Ukraine's GDP outlook for this year isn't looking good. In March, the IMF estimated a GDP contraction this year in the range of 25 to 35%. And in April, the World Bank estimated an even greater contraction of 45%, with the worst affected areas, unsurprisingly, being in the east of Ukraine. In fact, the Ukrainian central bank already reckons that Ukraine's GDP has shrunk by 50% since the war began, which means that the true figure could be even larger than those already terrifying estimates. So you get the idea. The war is going to cripple Ukraine's economy. But what about after the war? What are Ukraine's prospects for a recovery? Well, as things stand, things aren't looking good. Rebuilding Ukraine will involve more than just repairing the $100 billion worth of damage done to infrastructure thus far. It will also involve investment into new technology, a new military, and even new political institutions. That's why the estimated cost of rebuilding Ukraine is so high. The Center for Economic Policy Research put the figure at between $200 and $450 billion, while the Ukrainian government has put it between $600 billion and $1 trillion. Just to remind you, Ukraine's entire GDP for 2020 was $150 billion, and it's expected to fall below $100 billion this year. Ukraine obviously can't borrow the money to make up the difference either. While the country had solid public finances going into the war, with a total government debt of just $75 billion and a debt to GDP burden that most European countries would envy, the war has certainly strained the public purse. Despite cutting back on public spending, the Ukrainian government is still spending $5 billion more than it receives in taxes each month. This is both because spending costs have increased, armies aren't cheap after all, and because revenues have collapsed. Government revenues have fallen by nearly 50% since the war began, with customs revenues falling by 75%. And this would translate to an annual deficit of about 60% of their GDP. For context, the average European deficit in 2021 was about 5%, and pre-war Ukraine was expected to run a 3% deficit. Anyway, all of this spending has pushed Ukraine's borrowing costs sky high, and its one-year bond currently has an inferred yield of over 50%. And it's not really like the central bank can just print money either. Ukraine's currency has fallen 10% against the dollar, and inflation is running at about 11%. Anyway, you get the idea. Ukraine's economy is struggling, and recovery certainly won't be easy. Ultimately, this means that Ukraine will need help from its Western allies long after the fighting has finished. And the big question is whether European and American electorates will be as keen on spending money to rebuild Ukraine as they have been sending them heavy weapons. Anyway, if this kind of economic talk isn't really your thing, then you should probably check out Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform that teaches you everything you need to know to better understand the modern world. Baffled by investment and finance? Well, they've got courses on maths and quantitative finance. Confused by coding? Well, they've got everything from the very basics right through to quantum computing. Unclear why you're losing millions? Well, there's no guarantee that Brilliant can help with that, but they do have courses on cryptocurrency and gambling. You get the point. Everything you want to learn about STEM is covered by Brilliant. And the best thing is that all of their courses are designed by award-winning instructors and built upon the principle of active learning. So you're gaining STEM knowledge by actually doing it. So if you want to improve with STEM, then you can sign up to Brilliant at brilliant.org/TLDREU. And the first 200 people to do so will get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for supporting the channel.